Welcome to Paper Moon Tales. Tonight, join Aria on a peaceful journey as she discovers the art of deep listening, gathering the gentle sounds of meadows, forests, oceans, and mountains. Find a comfortable position. Let your breathing slow. If this story brings you peace, please like and subscribe to help us create more calming tales for restful sleep. Now, let us begin. The story of Aria, the sound collector. Chapter 1. The Quiet Awakening. In a small cottage nestled between rolling hills and whispering meadows, there lived someone who had learned to listen in ways most people had forgotten. Her name was Aria, and she was a collector, not of stamps or coins or curious artifacts, but of something far more ephemeral and precious: sounds. The cottage itself seemed to breathe with gentleness. Its stone walls, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, held within them the memory of every season that had passed. Climbing roses wound their way around the wooden door, their leaves rustling softly in the morning breeze. Aria had not always been a sound collector. There was a time, many years ago, when she had lived in the city, a place of constant noise that crashed and clattered and never truly rested. Car horns, construction sites, the endless chatter of crowds. It had all blurred together into a kind of gray static that filled her days and haunted her nights. But then, one autumn evening, something had shifted. She had been walking through a park, trying to escape the cacophony of rush hour when she heard it, the sound of a single leaf falling from an oak tree. It spiraled down through the still air and landed with the softest whisper on the grass beside her feet. Most people would never have noticed. The sound was so quiet, so delicate, that it could barely be called a sound at all. But Aria heard it. And in that moment, something within her chest, something that had been clenched tight for years, began to unfurl. She stood very still, hardly daring to breathe, and listened. Around her, the city's roar continued, but beneath it, hidden like treasure, were other sounds. The flutter of a sparrow's wings as it settled on a branch. The distant tinkle of wind chimes from an apartment balcony. The rustle of someone turning a page in a book on a nearby bench. From that day forward, Aria began to collect sounds, not with recording devices or technology. Those captured the sound but somehow lost its soul. Instead, she collected them with her memory, her attention, and eventually with her heart. She developed a practice. Each morning, she would wake before dawn and sit by her window, waiting for the world to emerge from sleep. The first sound was always the most precious. Sometimes a robin's liquid note, testing the darkness. Other times the wind stirring, as if the earth itself were stretching and yawning. On this particular morning, as our story truly begins, Aria opened her eyes to a world wrapped in mist. The early spring air was cool and damp, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and new growth. She rose slowly, wrapping a soft woolen shawl around her shoulders, and moved to the window. The cottage overlooked a small valley where a stream wound its way between stones and roots. The water's voice changed with the seasons and the weather. Sometimes it was a cheerful babble, other times a quiet murmur, and during the spring melt, a rushing conversation full of urgency and joy. Today, the stream spoke in hushed tones, as if sharing secrets with the stones. Aria stilled herself, drawing inward. She had learned that true listening required more than just ears. It required stillness of mind, openness of heart, and a kind of patience that modern life rarely afforded. She breathed slowly, letting each inhale bring her more fully into the present moment. The first sound she collected that morning was the mist itself. Most people think of mist as silent, but Aria knew better. It had a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, as it moved through the air, touching everything with gentle, damp fingers. It was like the breath of the earth, slow and ancient, and infinitely peaceful. She opened a small leather-bound journal that sat on the windowsill, her book of sounds. In it, she kept notes, not of the sounds themselves, for how can one truly capture sound in words, but of the feelings they evoked, the memories they stirred, the colors and textures they seemed to carry. "Spring mist," she wrote in her elegant script, "like silk being drawn across the skin of the world, the color of pearl, the texture of possibility." As the morning slowly brightened, other sounds emerged. A wood pigeon began its gentle cooing from somewhere in the oak trees that bordered her garden. The sound was round and full, each note like a smooth stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of peace that spread outward into the day. Aria smiled. The wood pigeon had been visiting her garden for 3 springs now. She had come to know its voice as one might know a friend's laugh. Familiar, comforting, a marker of continuity in an ever-changing world. She went to her small kitchen and began to prepare her morning tea. Even this simple act was full of sounds worth collecting. The strike of a match, the soft roar as the flame caught, the gradual build of the kettle's song as the water inside began to warm. First a few small ticks, then a whisper, then a gentle rumble, and finally the full rolling boil that sent steam rising in soft clouds. Aria poured the water over tea leaves in a ceramic pot and listened to the subtle sound it made, different from pouring water into a cup or onto soil or into a stream. Each vessel, each substance, created its own unique voice when water met it. She carried her tea to a chair by the fireplace, though no fire burned there now. Spring was too gentle for fires. Instead, the hearth held a vase of early wildflowers, primroses and wood anemones that she had gathered the day before. As she sipped her tea, Aria thought about her collection. Over the years, she had gathered thousands of sounds in her memory. The crack of ice breaking up on the pond in early March. The papery rustle of poppy petals falling in summer. The deep silence of fresh snowfall. The particular creak of her garden gate. The sound of rain on different surfaces, on leaves, on stone, on water, on earth. But lately, she had been feeling a pull towards something more. Her collection, vast as it was, lived only in her own mind and heart. What would happen to all these gathered moments of acoustic beauty when she was gone? Sounds were even more ephemeral than life itself. They existed for mere seconds before dissolving back into silence. She had been dreaming of creating something, a library, perhaps, or a sanctuary. A place where sounds could be preserved, not in the cold amber of recordings, but in the living memory of other listeners. A place where people could come to remember how to hear the world's gentler voices. The dream felt too large, too ambitious for someone who lived alone in a small cottage. But it persisted, growing stronger with each passing day, like a seed that had been planted in her heart and was now reaching toward light. As the morning mist began to lift, Aria made a decision. She would take a journey. She would travel through the world. Not far, for the world's most beautiful sounds were often found in humble places, and she would collect sounds with new intention. She would gather them not just for herself, but as gifts to be shared. She didn't know yet how this would work. She didn't know who would listen, or where her journey would lead, but she felt, with a certainty that lived in her bones, that this was the next chapter of her life calling to her. Aria rose and went to her bedroom, where she kept a leather satchel that had belonged to her grandmother. It was soft with age, the color of autumn leaves. She packed it carefully. Her journal, a fountain pen, a small flask of water, some bread and cheese, and a warm scarf. Then she added one more thing, a small, empty glass jar. It was the kind of jar that might hold jam or honey, simple and clear. She held it up to the window, watching the morning light pass through it. This jar would be symbolic, a reminder that she was collecting something as invisible and precious as air itself. She closed the cottage door behind her and stood for a moment on the threshold, listening. The world was waking fully now. Birds were calling to each other across the valley. The stream's voice had brightened. Somewhere in the distance she could hear sheep bells, a gentle, irregular music that spoke of pastoral peace. Aria smiled and began to walk down the path that led away from her cottage. She didn't know exactly where she was going. She would let the sounds guide her, as a sailor might follow stars. The path wound through a meadow where the grass was still wet with dew. Each step made a soft, whispering sound. The hem of her long skirt brushed against wildflowers, creating a gentle swish that accompanied her like a quiet companion. As she walked, she began to notice how the soundscape changed with each step. Near the cottage, the sounds had been familiar, known friends welcoming her to the day. But as she moved farther away, new sounds emerged. An unfamiliar bird call, bright and questioning. The distant sound of water. Not her stream, but another, somewhere ahead. This was the beginning of her journey. The path stretched before her, winding into mystery, and all around her the world was singing its ancient, ever-new song. Chapter 2. The First Collection. The path led Aria through the meadow and down a gentle slope toward a place she had visited only once before, a small orchard that stood at the edge of the valley. It was early enough in spring that the trees were just beginning to blossom, their branches decorated with clouds of white and pink flowers that seemed to glow in the soft morning light. As she approached, the first thing she noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but a particular quality of quiet that felt full and expectant, like a breath held before a song begins. Then she heard it, the hum of bees. It started as a single voice, then two, then suddenly the air was alive with their industrious music. The bees moved from blossom to blossom with remarkable purpose, their wings creating a sound that was both gentle and vital. The sound of life continuing, of nature doing what it had done for millions of years. Aria stood very still at the edge of the orchard, letting the sound wash over her. The bees' hum had layers to it. There was the high, bright note of their wings, but beneath that was something deeper, almost a drone, like a distant cello holding a single note. Together, the sounds created a harmony that spoke of ancient rhythms, of springs beyond counting, of blossoms that had opened and faded and opened again. She closed her eyes and listened with her whole being. This was the kind of sound she had come to find, not dramatic or loud, but rich with meaning. The sound of bees in an orchard was the sound of abundance being made, of flowers being transformed into fruit, of a collaboration between plant and insect that sustained the world. She opened her journal and captured the moment. Bees and spring orchard, like a small engine of life itself, the color of honey and sunlight, the texture of diligence and ancient partnership. As she stood there, an old man emerged from between the trees. He wore a canvas jacket and carried a wicker basket. His face was weathered and kind, with deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent outdoors, watching the seasons turn. As he walked, he hummed softly to himself, a melody without words that seemed to match the rhythm of the bees. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice quiet so as not to disturb the bees. "The sound, I mean. Most folks just see the orchard, but you're listening to it." Aria smiled. "I collect sounds," she said simply, "the peaceful ones, the ones that help us remember what matters." The old man nodded as if this made perfect sense. "I'm Thomas. I tend these trees. Have done for 40 years now." He paused, listening to the bees himself. "They sing different songs, depending on the weather, you know. On warm days like this, they're energetic, busy. But when a storm is coming, their sound gets lower, more cautious." "You listen to them too," Aria said. It was not a question. A good orchardist listens. The trees tell you when they're thirsty. The bees tell you when the season's turning. Even the wind has things to say, if you pay attention." They stood together in companionable silence, two listeners in a world that had forgotten how to be quiet. After a while, Thomas spoke again. "There's a special place in the orchard, if you'd like to hear it, an old apple tree at the center. She's been here longer than I have, maybe 200 years. When the wind blows, she creaks and sighs in a way that, well, you should hear it yourself. He led Aria through rows of younger trees until they reached the center of the orchard. There stood an ancient apple tree, her trunk thick and gnarled, her branches spreading wide like welcoming arms. Despite her age, she was covered in blossoms, white petals that seemed to glow against the dark wood. A breeze stirred, and the old tree began to speak. It was not a loud sound, but it was unmistakable. The trunk creaked, a deep, woody sound full of character. The branches swayed, creating a softer creaking, almost a sigh. The leaves, still young and tender, rustled with a delicate whisper, and the blossoms made a sound like the softest rain as the wind moved through them, causing a few petals to spiral down and land on the grass below. Aria felt tears prick her eyes. This was exactly what she had hoped to find. A sound that carried within it the weight of time, the persistence of life, the quiet dignity of something that had weathered countless storms and still bloomed. "She's remarkable," Aria whispered. Thomas nodded. "I sometimes come here when I'm troubled, just to listen." She's seen everything. Harsh winters, dry summers, 2 world wars, the births and deaths of everyone who's ever tended her. And still she blooms. Her sound, it reminds me that life goes on, that there's a steadiness beneath all the chaos. Later she would write, "The old apple tree, her voice is patience itself, the sound of 2 centuries of springs, the color of white petals against dark wood, the texture of endurance and grace." She stayed with the tree for a long time, listening as the wind rose and fell, as the bees continued their work, as the sun climbed higher and the light changed from silver to gold. Thomas eventually excused himself. He had work to do, but he told Aria she was welcome to stay as long as she liked. "Listeners are always welcome here," he said. After he left, Aria settled herself on the grass beneath the old tree and simply existed in the soundscape around her. She noticed how the sounds changed as the morning progressed. As the day warmed, the bees became more active, their humming growing louder and more complex. Birds began to visit the orchard, a robin with its liquid song, a wren whose call was bright and intricate. She could hear sheep in a distant field, their bleating carried on the breeze. Somewhere farther away, church bells rang the hour, the sound softened by distance until it was just a gentle suggestion of human presence in the pastoral landscape. But the sound she returned to again and again was that of the old apple tree. Something about it anchored her, the way a low note in music anchors a chord. It was a sound that spoke of rootedness, of being so deeply connected to a place that nothing could move you. Around midday, Aria ate the bread and cheese she had packed, savoring the simple food and the sounds that accompanied it. The crunch of bread crust, the soft sound of cheese being pulled apart, the whisper of her own breathing. She realized that part of collecting sounds was learning to appreciate silence, or what most people called silence. True silence, she had learned, was rare. There was almost always some sound, if you listened carefully enough. The whisper of air moving, the distant call of a bird, the sound of your own heartbeat if you were still enough. As the afternoon wore on, clouds began to gather, soft and gray. The light changed, becoming more diffused, and with it the sounds of the orchard shifted too. The bees began to return to their hives. The birds' songs became less frequent. Even the old apple tree's voice changed as the wind dropped, becoming quieter, more introspective. Then, so gentle that Aria almost missed it, the first drops of rain began to fall. This was a sound she had collected many times before, but never quite like this. The rain fell on the blossoms with a sound like the tiniest bells. It fell on the leaves with a soft patter. It fell on the grass with a whisper. Each surface created its own note, and together they formed a symphony of such delicate beauty that Aria felt her heart might overflow. She didn't seek shelter. The rain was warm and light, more mist than downpour. She sat beneath the old tree and let the rain's music wash over her, adding another layer to the orchard's song. With careful fingers, she noted in her journal, now slightly damp, spring rain in the orchard, each raindrop a quiet greeting, the sound of the earth drinking. The color of silver and green, the texture of gentleness itself. The rain lasted perhaps 20 minutes, then moved on, leaving everything glistening and fresh. The scent of wet earth and rain-washed blossoms filled the air, and though scent was not her primary collection, Aria noticed it gratefully. All the senses, she had learned, were connected. A sound could carry a scent, a color, a feeling. As the sun emerged from behind the clouds, casting long golden rays through the orchard, Aria knew it was time to continue her journey. She had collected her first sounds: the bees, the old tree, the rain on blossoms. Each was now stored in her memory, joined to the thousands of others she had gathered over the years. But these felt different. These were collected with intention, with the knowledge that they were part of something larger. They were the beginning of her gift to the world. She stood and placed her hand on the trunk of the old apple tree, feeling the rough bark beneath her palm. "Thank you," she whispered. The tree said nothing, of course, but a breeze stirred her branches, and Aria chose to take it as acknowledgement. She shouldered her leather satchel and walked on, following the path as it wound out of the orchard and toward the forest that rose in the distance. Behind her, the orchard settled back into its ancient rhythms, the bees resuming their work, the trees standing patient and still, the old apple at the center holding all their stories in her weathered wood. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of amber and rose. Aria walked steadily, her footsteps quiet on the path, her ears. Chapter 3: The Forest Symphony. The path narrowed as Aria entered the forest, and the world changed around her. Where the orchard had been open and filled with light, the forest was a place of shadow and depth, of verticality and ancient presence. The air itself felt different here, cooler, damper, rich with the scent of moss and leaf mold and living wood. Aria paused at the forest's edge, allowing her senses to adjust, letting the new soundscape reveal itself to her patient attention. The first thing she noticed was how the quality of sound changed beneath the canopy. In the open meadow and orchard, sounds had traveled freely, spreading outward into space. Here they were contained, softened by countless leaves, absorbed by thick tree trunks, given texture by the very density of the forest itself. She took a step forward, and the ground beneath her feet made a different sound than it had in the meadow. Here, the path was covered in layers of fallen leaves and pine needles, creating a soft, cushioned surface that whispered rather than crunched. Aria walked slowly, listening. The forest, she realized, was not one soundscape but many, layered upon each other like the strata of the earth itself. There were the high sounds, the canopy sounds, wind moving through the uppermost branches of oak and ash and pine. The occasional call of a bird high above, a jay's harsh cry, a crow's conversational caw. These sounds came from a world she couldn't see, a green ceiling where squirrels leaped and woodpeckers hunted. And the trees, youngest leaves caught the sunlight that barely reached the forest floor. Then there were the middle sounds, the sounds of the trunks and the air between them, the creak of wood as trees swayed in the breeze, the flutter of wings as smaller birds moved between branches, the rustle of leaves at the middle height, where the understory shrubs grew. And finally, there were the low sounds, the forest floor's quiet conversations, the scatter of a small creature moving through the leaf litter, the drip of water from leaves still wet from the earlier rain, the almost imperceptible sound of moss growing, of mushrooms pushing up through the soil, of roots drinking deep. Aria found a fallen log and sat down, setting her satchel beside her. She would need time to truly hear this place. The forest was complex, and complexity required patience. She sat very still, her breath slowing to match the forest's quiet rhythm. At first, her mind wanted to identify each sound, to catalog and name. That bird, a blackbird. That rustling, probably a mouse or vole. That creaking, an oak tree. But gradually she let go of the need to name and simply listened to the forest as a whole. It was like listening to an orchestra, she thought. You could focus on individual instruments, the violin, the flute, the drums, or you could let them all blend together into something greater than the sum of their parts. The forest was playing a symphony that had been going on for thousands of years, and would continue long after she was gone. Time seemed to slow down and become liquid. Minutes or hours passed. Aria couldn't tell which. The light shifted subtly as the sun moved across the sky beyond the canopy. Shafts of golden light appeared and disappeared between the leaves, making the dust motes dance and giving texture to the air itself. A deer appeared, so quietly that Aria didn't notice it at first. It was a young doe, stepping carefully between the trees, her large eyes alert, her ears swiveling to catch every sound. She hadn't seen Aria yet, and Aria remained perfectly still, barely breathing. The doe moved with extraordinary grace, each step placed with precision. Her hooves made the softest sounds on the forest floor, a gentle pressure, a quiet displacement of leaves. She paused to nibble at some tender shoots, the sound of her eating almost musical, a soft tearing of leaves, a contemplative chewing. Then the doe froze, her head lifting, and Aria knew she had been noticed. For a long moment, they looked at each other, woman and deer, two creatures of different species sharing the forest's cathedral. The doe's breathing was visible, her chest rising and falling. Aria could just barely hear it, a soft, rhythmic whisper. Then, apparently deciding that Aria posed no threat, the doe relaxed slightly. She didn't leave, but continued her browsing, moving in a slow circle around the small clearing. Aria felt honored beyond words. To be accepted by a wild creature, to be deemed safe enough to ignore, this was a gift. She listened to the deer's gentle movements, storing each sound in her memory. The sound of wildness, choosing to stay rather than flee. The sound of trust. Eventually, the doe moved on, disappearing into the forest as silently as she had come. Aria released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She drew her journal close and wrote, "Young deer in the forest," her movements like a careful dance, the sound of grace itself, the color of dappled light on brown fur, the texture of wildness and gentleness intertwined. As the afternoon deepened, the forest's sounds began to change. The birdsong, so constant earlier, became less frequent. In the growing silence, other sounds emerged, sounds that belonged to the edge of day. Walking between two trees, Aria felt the lightest touch across her face and heard the most delicate snap, so quiet she almost missed it. A spider's web, spun in the afternoon between branches, had broken at her passing. The sound was impossibly fine, like a single thread of silk giving way, and it carried with it a whole story. Hours of patient spinning, undone in an instant. Aria paused, marveling at how even such tiny, fragile sounds were part of the forest's language. Aria heard a woodpecker drilling into a tree, the rapid-fire percussion echoing through the forest. It was a vital sound, full of purpose and determination. The woodpecker was hunting insects, creating a home, declaring its territory, all through that distinctive rhythm that was older than human music, but somehow musical nonetheless. She followed the sound and found the bird, a great spotted woodpecker, clinging to the trunk of an old beech tree. Its head moved so fast it was almost a blur, and the sound it made seemed impossibly loud for such a small creature. Yet there was something joyful about it, something celebratory, as if the woodpecker were playing the tree like a drum, just for the pleasure of it. Aria smiled and moved on, leaving the woodpecker to its work. The path led her deeper into the forest, to a place where the trees grew so thick that the light was green and dim, even though the sun had not yet set. Here, she found something unexpected, a small stream, barely 2 feet wide, flowing over smooth stones. This was a different water voice than the stream near her cottage. That stream was established, confident, knowing its path well. This stream was younger, more tentative, feeling its way through the forest, around roots and under fallen branches, finding the easiest path to lower ground. Aria knelt beside it and listened to its song. The water made different sounds as it encountered different obstacles. Where it flowed over smooth stones, it created a gentle burbling. Where it dropped a few inches over a small ledge of rock, it became a miniature waterfall, a bright splash. Where it pooled in a hollow, it spoke in quieter tones, contemplative and deep. She noticed something moving in the stream and leaned closer. It was a leaf, fallen from some tree upstream, now carried along by the current. She watched it navigate the tiny rapids, spin in an eddy, pause in a pool, then continue on its journey toward the distant sea. The sound of the leaf in the water was almost nothing, the faintest whisper, but Aria heard it. The sound of something letting go, allowing itself to be carried, trusting the current to take it where it needed to go. She stayed by the stream until the light began to truly fade. The forest at dusk was entering a transitional time. No longer the domain of day creatures, not yet fully claimed by the night. It was a liminal time, a threshold, and the sounds reflected this. The daytime birds fell silent. There was a pause, a breath, a moment of stillness. Then the first owl called, a soft hoot from somewhere in the darkening canopy. It was answered by another, farther away. The owls were waking, claiming the night, announcing their presence to each other. Aria felt a shiver run down her spine, not of fear, but of awe. The owl's call was ancient and wild, a sound that had echoed through forests long before humans walked the earth. It spoke of hunting and survival, of keen eyes and silent wings, of a different kind of wisdom than humans possessed. She stood and looked around. The forest was growing dark, and she would need to find a place to spend the night. She had not planned to sleep outdoors, but the day's walking had taken her farther than she'd expected, and she was not troubled by the prospect. The night, after all, had its own sounds to collect. She found a spot beneath a large pine tree, where the ground was relatively soft with fallen needles. She gathered a few armfuls of dry leaves and made herself a simple bed, then wrapped herself in her warm scarf and lay down, looking up through the branches of the sky above. The stars were beginning to appear, tiny points of light in the deepening blue. Aria watched them emerge, one by one, and listened to the forest settle into night. New sounds arose, the buzz of night insects, the distant call of a fox, a sharp, almost human-sounding cry that made her skin prickle, the rustle of something small moving through the underbrush, beginning its nightly rounds. The wind shifted, and the pine tree above her began to sing. It was a different sound than the oak or the apple tree had made, higher, more sustained, almost like a chorus of voices humming in harmony. The pine needles, so much finer than broad leaves, created a sound like silk being drawn across silk. A whisper that spoke of northern forests and mountains and the clean, resinous scent of evergreen. Aria pulled her scarf closer and felt her eyes growing heavy. The day had been long and full, and her mind was rich with sounds. The bees in the orchard, the old apple tree, the rain on blossoms, the deer's careful steps, the woodpecker's drumming, the stream's many voices, the owl's ancient call, the pine tree's lullaby. By touch alone in the darkness, she recorded night in the forest, the sound of the earth breathing, the color of starlight through pine branches, the texture of belonging to something vast and old. Then she closed the journal, pillowed her head on her satchel, and let the forest symphony carry her into sleep. Above her, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky. Around her, the forest continued its endless conversations, tree to tree, creature to creature, wind to leaf, water to stone. And Aria, the sound. Chapter 4. Coastal Whispers. Aria woke to birdsong and the soft patter of rain on the pine canopy above. She had slept deeply, held by the forest's ancient embrace, and she rose, feeling refreshed and peaceful. The morning rain was gentle, more mist than downpour, and she stood beneath the sheltering pine to eat a simple breakfast of bread and water. The forest around her was alive with the sounds of water, dripping from leaves, trickling down bark, collecting in hollows and depressions in the earth. She consulted the map she had brought, though it was old and hand-drawn. According to its faded lines, if she continued westward through the forest, she would eventually reach the coast. The thought of the sea called to her. She had visited the ocean only a handful of times in her life, and its sounds had always moved her deeply. The vastness they contained, the rhythm eternal as breathing, the suggestion of distances beyond imagining. She packed her satchel and set off through the dripping forest. The path descended gradually, and as the morning progressed, she began to notice changes in the landscape. The trees shifted from oak and pine to more coastal varieties, windswept hawthorn, salt-tolerant willow. The air changed too, gaining a sharpness, a mineral quality that spoke of proximity to the sea. And then, gradually, she began to hear it, the distant whisper of waves. It was so faint at first that she thought she might be imagining it, but as she walked, it grew stronger. A rhythmic susurration that seemed to breathe in harmony with her own breath. The forest thinned, the path widened, and suddenly she emerged from the trees onto a cliff top overlooking the sea. The sight took her breath away. The ocean stretched before her, vast and gray and beautiful under the overcast sky. Waves rolled toward the shore in long, gentle lines, breaking against dark rocks and sandy beaches. Seabirds wheeled and called in the air above the water. The wind, unobstructed here, moved freely across the cliff top, carrying with it the scent of salt and seaweed and distance. But it was the sound that captivated Aria most completely. The ocean had a voice unlike anything else on earth. It was constant yet ever-changing, rhythmic yet never precisely the same. Each wave that broke was unique, yet part of an endless pattern that had continued for eons. Aria stood at the cliff's edge and listened. There was the sound of the waves themselves, the build and crest and crash, followed by the hiss and fizz as the water spread across the sand and withdrew, pulling small stones and shells with it. It was a breathing sound, an inhale and exhale, as if the earth itself were respiring. There was the sound of the wind across the water, different from the wind through trees. Here, it had traveled across miles of open ocean and arrived carrying stories from far away, from islands and ships, from storms and calms, from places Aria would never see. There were the cries of seabirds, gulls with their raw, mewing calls that seemed to stretch and bend like the wind itself, terns with their staccato cries sharp as needles, the occasional deeper call of a cormorant, guttural and ancient. These birds spoke in voices shaped by salt and space, by fishing and flight, by lives lived between air and water. And beneath it all, or perhaps through it all, was something else, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the ocean itself. It was the sound of vastness, of depth, of water covering more than 2/3 of the earth. It was a sound you felt as much as heard, a vibration in your chest, a reminder of how small you were and how large the world. Aria stood transfixed for a long time, letting the ocean's symphony wash over her. The mist rain had stopped, and gaps were beginning to appear in the clouds, allowing shafts of silver light to illuminate patches of the sea's surface. Eventually, she found a path that led down the cliff face to the beach below. It was steep and narrow, and she descended carefully, listening to how the ocean's sound changed as she got closer to it. At sea level, the sound was different, louder, more immediate, more physical. She could feel the vibration of the waves through the sand beneath her feet. The spray carried on the wind touched her face with tiny droplets, each one bringing a whisper of the ocean's voice. She walked along the beach, and the sand made its own sound beneath her feet, a soft, shifting crunch like walking on sugar or salt. The tide was out, and the beach was wide, scattered with tide pools and rocks draped with seaweed. Aria approached one of the tide pools and knelt beside it. These small worlds, left behind by the retreating tide, had their own delicate soundscapes. She leaned close and listened. There was the gentle slosh of water in the pool as it responded to the vibration of waves hitting the shore nearby. There was the tick and click of small crustaceans moving among the rocks. There was a sound like the tiniest bells as water dripped from seaweed fronds back into the pool. She watched a small crab scuttle sideways across a rock, its legs making minute clicking sounds. An anemone waved its tentacles in the water's gentle current, creating the faintest whisper. A small fish darted from shadow to shadow, its movement causing ripples that lapped against the pool's edges with sounds softer than breath. In her journal, Aria wrote, "Tide pool on a gray morning. A world entire in water no deeper than my hand. The sound of small lives continuing. The color of sea green and stone. The texture of resilience and adaptation." As she continued down the beach, she found other treasures. A piece of driftwood, worn smooth by salt and sand, that chimed softly when she tapped it with her knuckle. A collection of shells that made different sounds when she lifted them and let the water drain out, some musical, some percussive, each unique. A strand of kelp that, when swung through the air, made a sound like a whip or a sigh. She sat on a large rock and watched the waves. There was a meditative quality to their repetition. Wave after wave after wave, each one traveling hundreds or thousands of miles before spending itself on this particular beach. The sound was hypnotic, and Aria felt herself sinking into a state of deep peace. A seal appeared in the water, its dark head bobbing among the waves. It regarded Aria with large, curious eyes, then dove beneath the surface, reappearing a moment later closer to shore. The seal made a sound, a snort and a splash, and Aria laughed with delight. The seal lingered for several minutes, fishing and playing in the shallows, seemingly unconcerned by Aria's presence. She could hear it breathing when it surfaced, deep, satisfied breaths. She could hear the splash as it dove, the sound of water closing over a sleek, streamlined body built for a world half aquatic, half terrestrial. Eventually, the seal swam away, heading north along the coastline, and Aria was alone again with the waves and wind and birds. The clouds were breaking up now, and patches of blue appeared overhead. When the sun emerged, it transformed the entire seascape. The water, which had been gray and subdued, suddenly sparkled and danced with light. The wet sand gleamed, the rocks threw sharp shadows, and the sound changed too. In the sunlight, the ocean seemed to speak with a brighter voice. The waves glittered as they broke, and Aria could swear she heard the light itself, a high, clear note that resonated with the water's rhythm. She knew this was probably imagination or synesthesia, her senses blending together. But it didn't matter. The experience was real, and the beauty was undeniable. As the afternoon progressed, the tide began to turn. Aria noticed the change first in the sound. The waves were coming slightly closer, reaching slightly farther up the beach with each successive surge. The tide pools would soon be reclaimed by the sea, their small inhabitants freed back into the larger world. She found a sheltered spot among the rocks and simply sat, listening to the ocean's eternal conversation with the land. As she rested her hand on a sun-warmed stone, she heard something extraordinary, the faintest crystalline whisper. Spray from an earlier wave had landed on the rock, and now, under the emerging sun, the water was evaporating, leaving behind tiny salt crystals. The sound of their formation was so delicate it might have been imagined, a microscopic crackling like the smallest stars being born. She held perfectly still, marveling that even the act of salt returning to solid form had a voice. Time seemed to lose meaning. She could have been sitting there for minutes or hours. It didn't matter. She was present, fully alive in each moment. Her awareness expanded to include the vast breathing presence of the sea. A poem began to form in her mind, not in words exactly, but in rhythms and feelings. The ocean was teaching her something about persistence and patience, about the power of gentle, repeated action. Water was soft, yielding, yet over time it shaped the hardest stone. The cliffs themselves were the ocean's sculpture, carved by millennia of waves and wind. In her journal she wrote, "The ocean's lesson, gentleness can reshape the world. The sound of patient power, the color of silver light on moving water, the texture of time itself, made audible." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Aria reluctantly prepared to leave the beach. She had collected sounds here that would stay with her forever. The waves, eternal rhythm, the seals breathing, the whisper of water in tide pools, the cries of seabirds, the deep resonance of vastness. She climbed back up the cliff path, pausing frequently to look back at the ocean. From above, she could see the patterns of the waves, the way they approached the shore in long, parallel lines, the way they broke around rocks and reformed on the other side. At the top of the cliff, she found a small coastal village, just a handful of cottages clustered around a tiny harbor. Smoke rose from chimneys, and warm light glowed in windows. The sight was welcoming after her day in the wild solitude of the forest and shore. As she approached the village, she heard a new sound, church bells ringing the evening hour. The sound carried across the open landscape, clear and pure. A human voice joining the natural symphony of wind and wave. The bells seemed to say, "You are not alone. There is community here. There is warmth and shelter and human kindness." Aria smiled and walked toward the village, toward light and warmth and the next chapter of her journey. Behind her, the ocean continued its endless conversation with the shore, wave after wave after wave, a sound that would outlast all human endeavor, a rhythm as ancient as the earth. Chapter 5. Mountain Echoes. The coastal village proved to be a place of gentle hospitality. Aria found lodging at a small inn overlooking the harbor, where the innkeeper, a woman named Margaret with silver hair and kind eyes, welcomed her warmly and asked no questions about her journey. Margaret had a distinctive laugh, rich and rolling like waves over pebbles, and it echoed through the inn at unexpected moments, making the old building feel alive with warmth. That night, Aria slept in a proper bed for the first time since leaving her cottage, listening to the distant sound of waves and the closer sound of the harbor's water lapping against stone walls and wooden boats. It was a soothing sound, a reminder that even in the midst of human habitation, the natural world continued its rhythms. In the morning, over breakfast, Margaret mentioned that if Aria was interested in collecting sounds, she should consider visiting the mountains that rose inland from the coast. "There's a valley up there," Margaret said, pouring tea into Aria's cup, "where the wind comes through just so. The old folks say you can hear voices in it. Not ghosts or anything frightening, just echoes. Sounds from long ago and far away. My grandmother used to go up there when she needed to think. Said it was the most peaceful place she'd ever known." Aria's interest was immediately kindled. Mountains would have sounds she had never properly collected. The sounds of height and stone, of thin air and vast views, of wind unobstructed by trees or buildings. "How would I find this valley?" she asked. Margaret drew her a simple map on a piece of paper, marking the path that led from the village up into the hills. "It's a day's walk," she said. "Steep in places, but not dangerous if you're careful. There's a shepherd's hut halfway up, where you can rest if you need to." She laughed her rolling laugh. "Though knowing you, you'll probably just sit and listen to the mountain wind for hours." Aria thanked her and set out after breakfast, her satchel repacked with fresh bread and cheese that Margaret had insisted she take. The path led away from the coast, climbing gradually at first through fields where sheep grazed. The sheep lifted their heads to watch her pass, their expressions placid and mildly curious. Their bells chimed softly with their movements, a gentle, irregular music that had accompanied shepherds and their flocks for thousands of years. Aria paused to listen to the sheep bells. Each bell had a slightly different tone, and together they created a random but somehow harmonious soundscape. There was something deeply peaceful about it, a sound that spoke of pastoral simplicity, of animals and humans living in cooperation, of traditions that persisted despite the modern world's changes. As she climbed higher, the landscape changed. The grasses grew shorter and tougher. Rocks pushed up through the soil. The air became cooler and crisper, carrying scents of heather and thyme. And the sounds changed too. The birds here were different from those of the forest or the coast. She heard the high, clear song of a skylark, somewhere overhead but invisible in the bright morning sky. The sound seemed to pour down from heaven itself, a cascade of pure joy that made her heart lift. She found the shepherd's hut around midday, a small stone structure with a turf roof nestled into the hillside. It was unlocked and empty, maintained as a shelter for anyone who might need it. Aria went inside and rested, eating some of her bread and cheese while listening to the wind whistle around the hut's corners. Even the wind sounded different up here. It was stronger, less interrupted, and it carried different information. She could hear it coming from a long way off, sweeping across the open mountainside before reaching the hut. It made the heather rustle, the grasses hiss, the loose stones rattle, It was a wild sound, untamed and free. After resting, she continued upward. The path grew steeper, and she had to watch her footing carefully, but the effort was worthwhile. For with each step upward, the world opened out beneath her. She could see the coast behind, and below her now, the ocean stretching to the horizon, the village reduced to a cluster of tiny shapes beside the harbor. Before and above her, the mountains rose, their peaks still touched with snow despite the advancing spring. The sounds of human habitation faded away completely. Here, there were only the sounds of earth and air and stone, the crunch of her boots on the rocky path, her own breathing, slightly labored with the climb, the wind in her ears, the occasional cry of a hawk or eagle soaring on thermal currents far above. As she rounded a bend in the path, the valley Margaret had mentioned suddenly revealed itself. It was a high mountain valley, ringed by steep slopes on 3 sides and open to the sky. A small stream ran through its center, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. The floor of the valley was covered in short grass and wildflowers, and scattered stones stood here and there like ancient sentinels. But it was the sound of the place that made Aria stop in her tracks. The wind came through the valley in a way that created extraordinary acoustic effects. As it funneled between the steep slopes, it was channeled and shaped, amplified and modulated. The result was a sound like voices, not words exactly, but tones and harmonies that rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost musical, almost linguistic. Aria stood at the valley's entrance and listened, her skin prickling with awe. The wind voices were low and high, near and distant. They overlapped and harmonized. They created echoes that bounced off the stone walls of the valley, multiplying and transforming, until it seemed as if a choir of invisible beings were singing an ancient song in a language older than words. She walked into the valley, and the sounds surrounded her. It was like walking into a cathedral made of air and stone, where the architecture itself was designed to create beauty through sound. She found a large, flat stone near the stream and sat down, pulling out her journal. But for a long time, she didn't write. She simply listened, letting the valley song wash over her. This was what she had been seeking without quite knowing it. A sound so beautiful, so peaceful, so filled with a sense of something greater than herself, that it bypassed thought entirely and went straight to the soul. The wind voices seemed to speak of time itself, of eons passing, of mountains rising and slowly wearing away, of ice ages coming and going, of the patient, inexorable processes that shaped the earth. They spoke without urgency, without fear, without the anxious grasping that characterized so much of human existence. Aria felt tears on her cheeks and didn't wipe them away. They were not tears of sadness, but of recognition. This sound, this place, they were teaching her something about peace that went beyond mere quietness. True peace, she understood, was not the absence of sound, but the presence of harmony. It was the alignment of things in their proper patterns, the world singing its own true song. As the afternoon progressed, the light in the valley changed. The sun, moving across the sky, illuminated different parts of the valley's walls, and with each change of light came a subtle change in the wind voices. The valley was like an instrument played by the sun and wind, creating music that was never quite the same from one moment to the next. Aria noticed movement and looked up to see a mountain goat picking its way across a steep slope. The animal moved with impossible confidence on terrain that would have been terrifying to a human, leaping from rock to rock with casual grace. The sounds the goat made were minimal: the click of hooves on stone, the rattle of a pebble dislodged and tumbling down the slope. But these small sounds fit perfectly into the valley's larger symphony, adding percussion to the wind's sustained tones. She watched the goat until it disappeared over a ridge, then turned her attention back to the stream. She moved closer to it and knelt by its edge, listening to the water's voice. Aria noticed movement and looked up to see a mountain goat picking its way across a steep slope. The animal moved with impossible confidence on terrain that would have been terrifying to a human, leaping from rock to rock with casual grace. The sounds the goat made were minimal: the click of hooves on stone, the rattle of a pebble dislodged and tumbling down the slope. But these small sounds fit perfectly into the valley's larger symphony, adding percussion to the wind's sustained tones. She watched the goat until it disappeared over a ridge, then turned her attention back to the stream. She moved closer to it and knelt by its edge, listening to the water's voice. Mountain water sounded different from lowland water. It was crisper, sharper, carrying the mineral taste and sound of stone and snow. It moved quickly, urgently, as if it remembered the height from which it had fallen and was eager to reach the sea. Yet, there was joy in its sound, too, the joy of movement, of purpose, of becoming. This water would flow down through the valley, join other streams, become a river, and eventually reach the ocean Aria had visited the day before. It was part of a cycle as old as the earth, and its sound carried that ancient pattern within it. In her journal, she captured what words could hold. The mountain valley where the wind sings, voices of stone and air, the sound of eternity made present, the color of clear light on snow and rock, the texture of patience and peace that surpasses understanding. As evening approached, the wind began to shift. The voices in the valley changed, becoming lower, more contemplative, as if the mountains themselves were settling down for the night. The light turned golden, then pink, then purple, as the sun sank toward the horizon. Aria knew she should probably start making her way back down to the shepherd's hut. It would be unwise to try to descend the steep path in darkness. But she was reluctant to leave this place. The valley had given her something precious, something she would carry with her always. She compromised by moving to a more sheltered spot near the valley wall, where an overhang of rock created a natural shelter. She wrapped herself in her scarf and sat with her back against the stone, watching the stars begin to appear overhead. The night sounds of the mountains were different from those of the forest. There were fewer creatures here, fewer individual voices. Instead, there was the constant presence of the wind, sometimes loud, sometimes quiet, but never entirely absent. There was the distant sound of water, and there was something else, a kind of silence that was almost a sound in itself. It was the silence of vastness, of spaces too large for sound to fill. It was the silence of stone that had stood for millions of years, and would stand for millions more. It was a peaceful silence, not empty, but full of potential, of presence, of the deep rest that comes from being exactly where and what you are meant to be. Aria felt that silence enter her, settling into the spaces between her thoughts, calming the constant motion of her mind. She felt herself relax at a level deeper than physical relaxation, a letting go that reached down to her very core. She dozed, drifting in and out of sleep, always aware of the wind's voices singing their ancient song. At some point deep in the night, she woke fully and looked up at the stars. They were extraordinarily bright at this altitude, away from any source of human light. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, and Aria felt vertigo, as if she might fall upward into that infinite expanse. She pulled her gaze back to Earth, to the dark shapes of the mountains against the star-filled sky, and felt grateful for gravity, for weight, for her connection to this world of stone and water and air. As dawn approached, the wind voices changed again, becoming brighter, more energetic, as if welcoming the new day. Aria rose, stiff and cold, but deeply rested in some essential way. She drank from the stream, packed her satchel, and took one last long look at the valley. "Thank you," she whispered, to the mountains, to the wind, to whatever presence inhabited this sacred place. The wind rose briefly, the voices swelling in what might have been acknowledgement, then settling back into their... Chapter 6. The Village at Dusk. The descent from the mountains took Aria most of the day. She moved slowly, not just because of the steep path, but because she wanted to savor the transition from the high, wild places back to the world of human habitation. As she descended, she noticed how the soundscape gradually changed. The wind's voices faded, becoming less mystical and more ordinary. Bird calls returned, first the mountain species, then, as she dropped lower, the familiar songs of thrush and finch. The air grew warmer and carried new scents: wood smoke, cultivated earth, the green smell of growing things. By late afternoon, she found herself walking through farmland. The fields were newly planted, the dark soil arranged in neat rows. A farmer was working in one field, guiding a horse-drawn plow, and the sight filled Aria with a quiet joy. This, too, was a kind of music. The partnership between human and animal, the patient work of preparing the earth to receive seeds. She could hear the jingle of the horse's harness, the soft encouragement the farmer offered to his animal companion, the slice of the plow blade through earth. These were sounds of cultivation, of care, of the human endeavor to live in harmony with the land rather than simply taking from it. The farmer noticed her and raised a hand in greeting. Aria waved back and continued on her way, following a lane lined with hedgerows that were just beginning to leaf out. The lane led her to a village, not the coastal village where she had stayed with Margaret, but a different one, inland and older, its stone buildings clustered around a central green where a large oak tree stood. The village was coming alive with the sounds of evening. Aria paused at the outskirts, taking a moment to simply listen to this human soundscape that was so different from the natural sounds she had been collecting. From somewhere came the ring of a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil, a bright, metallic percussion that spoke of creation and repair. From another direction came children's laughter as they played some game on the green. A dog barked, not aggressively but conversationally, and another dog answered from across the village. Doors opened and closed. Voices called greetings to neighbors. Water splashed from a pump in someone's garden. The smell of cooking drifted on the air, and with it the subtle sounds of domestic life. Pots clattering, a knife on a cutting board, the sizzle of something in a pan. Aria walked toward the village green and sat on a bench beneath the old oak tree. The children playing nearby glanced at her curiously, but quickly returned to their game. An elderly man sat on another bench, smoking a pipe, his weathered face peaceful in the evening light. Every few moments, he tapped the pipe against the bench's armrest in a particular rhythm. 3 soft taps, then a pause, as if keeping time to some internal music only he could hear. "Passing through?" he asked, his voice friendly. "In a way," Aria replied. "I collect sounds. I'm on a journey to gather the peaceful ones." The old man considered this, puffing on his pipe. "Sounds, eh? Well, you've come to a good place. This village has been here for 500 years. That oak you're sitting under was planted before my great-grandfather was born. It's heard everything. Weddings and funerals, celebrations and sorrows. But mostly just ordinary life, day after day, year after year." Aria looked up into the oak's branches. The tree was massive, its trunk so large that 3 people linking hands could barely encircle it. New leaves were unfurling, tender and bright green against the darkening sky. "Does it make sounds?" she asked. "The tree, I mean." "Oh, yes," the old man said. "In the wind, of course, but also just, well, it's hard to explain. Sometimes, when it's very quiet, you can hear the tree living, the sap rising, the leaves breathing. Or maybe that's just fancy. But I've sat under this tree for more years than I can count, and I swear it has a presence, a sound all its own." Aria closed her eyes and listened. At first, she heard only the village sounds, the children, the distant hammer, a cart rattling past on the cobblestones. But gradually, as she settled into stillness, she began to hear what the old man meant. The oak tree did have a presence. It was subtle, almost subliminal, but it was there. A kind of deep, slow vibration, like the lowest note on an organ. It was the sound of rootedness, of patience, of life lived in one place across centuries. "I hear it?" she whispered. The old man smiled. "Thought you might." You have the ears for it." They sat in companionable silence as the evening deepened. The children were called home for supper, their voices fading into houses. Lamps were lit in windows, creating warm pools of light against the gathering dusk. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. The village was settling into the gentle rhythms of evening. Church bells rang, marking the hour, and Aria felt a deep sense of peace. These bells were different from the ones she had heard at the coast. Older, deeper, more resonant. They spoke of continuity, of generations who had heard these same tones mark the passing hours of their lives. "Where will you stay tonight?" the old man asked. "I'm not sure," Aria admitted. "Is there an inn?" "Not as such, but Martha, she lives in the house with the blue door there. She sometimes takes in travelers. Tell her Robert sent you." Aria thanked him and made her way to the house with the blue door. She knocked, and it was opened by a woman in her 50s, with flour on her hands and a warm smile on her face. When Aria explained that Robert had sent her, Martha welcomed her immediately. "Any friend of Robert's is welcome here. Come in, come in. I was just making bread for tomorrow, but there's stew on the stove and you're welcome to share it." The interior of the house was cozy and smelled of baking bread and herbs. Aria was shown to a small guest room upstairs, where she left her satchel, then joined Martha in the kitchen. The sounds of Martha's kitchen were a symphony in themselves, the bubble and simmer of the stew pot, the soft thump of dough being kneaded, the creak of the oven door, the clink of bowls and spoons being gathered for the meal, and beneath it all, Martha hummed. Not a particular melody, but a wordless, contented sound that rose and fell like breathing, the unconscious music of someone at peace with her work. Martha talked as she worked, sharing village news and stories, her voice as comfortable as the kitchen itself. Aria listened, offering occasional comments, but mostly just absorbing the warmth of human hospitality. They ate together at a scrubbed wooden table, the stew rich and nourishing, accompanied by thick slices of yesterday's bread. Through the window, Aria could see the evening star appearing in the darkening sky. After dinner, Martha made tea and they sat by the fire. The sounds of the fire were complex, the snap and crackle of burning wood, the hiss of sap, the occasional pop as a knot exploded in the heat. But beneath the individual sounds was something else, a kind of purr, a contentment, as if fire itself were expressing satisfaction at being allowed to do its ancient work of providing warmth and light. "You're a quiet one," Martha observed, but she said it kindly, without judgment. "I listen more than I speak," Aria explained. "I've found that when we're truly quiet, the world has so much to tell us." Martha nodded thoughtfully. "My husband was like that. He passed 5 years ago, but he was a man of few words. Used to drive me mad sometimes, me chattering away and him just listening, but after he was gone..." She paused, looking into the fire. "I realized how rare that is. Someone who truly listens." They sat in companionable silence, the fire crackling between them, and Aria felt a deep kinship with this woman she had just met. There were different ways of listening, she thought. Listening to nature, listening to sounds, but also listening to people, to their spoken words and their unspoken feelings. All of it was part of the same practice: being present, paying attention, allowing the world and its inhabitants to be heard. Later, Aria lay in the small guest bed, listening to the night sounds of the village. They were different from the night sounds of the forest or mountains. Here, there were human sounds woven into the natural ones. A door closing somewhere, late footsteps on cobblestones, a cat yowling, the distant sound of someone playing a fiddle. But there were natural sounds too: an owl calling from the churchyard, the wind in the old oak tree, the scurry of mice in the walls. Not unpleasant, just part of the ancient compact between humans and the small creatures who shared their spaces. And beneath all of it was the sound of the village itself, a collective presence, a community breathing in unison, resting but never quite silent. It was the sound of people living together, of neighbors who knew each other's names and histories, of a place where everyone belonged to a larger whole. By candlelight, she wrote in her journal, "The village at dusk, human sounds and natural sounds intertwined." The sound of community, of continuity, of lives lived in connection, the color of lamplight in windows, the texture of home. She blew out the candle and lay in the darkness, feeling grateful for the day's journey, for the kindness of strangers, for the privilege of witnessing so many different kinds of peace. Tomorrow, she knew, she would continue her journey, but tonight, she would rest here, held by the gentle sounds of a village that had endured for 5 centuries, and would, with care and luck, endure for many more. The old oak tree stood sentinel in the green, its leaves rustling softly in the night breeze, keeping watch as it had done for longer than human. Chapter 7: The Library of Sounds. Aria woke to the sound of bread baking. The scent filled the house, warm and yeasty, and she rose feeling deeply rested. Martha had been up for hours, and when Aria came downstairs, she found the kitchen table laden with fresh bread, butter, honey, and tea. Over breakfast, Aria told Martha about her journey, about the orchard and the forest, the ocean and the mountains, the sounds she had been collecting. Martha listened with interest, then said something that surprised Aria. "You should visit the old monastery. It's a half-day's walk from here, east toward the hills. It's been abandoned for 50 years, but the building still stands. My grandmother used to say it was built specifically for sound, the acoustics, you know. The monks used to chant there, and she said it was like hearing angels sing." Aria felt a stirring of excitement, a place built for sound. This she had to experience. After thanking Martha profusely for her hospitality, Aria set out toward the east, following directions that Martha had carefully written out. The morning was bright and clear, and her path took her through countryside that was gentle and cultivated. Fields and hedgerows, small copses of trees, an occasional farmhouse. As she walked, she reflected on her journey so far. She had collected so many sounds, each one a gift, each one teaching her something about peace, about patience, about the infinite variety of ways that existence could express itself through vibration and rhythm. But she still felt the pull of her original question. How could these sounds be preserved and shared? How could she create something that would outlive her own memory? The monastery appeared around midday, rising from a small valley like something from another time. It was built of golden stone that glowed in the sunlight, its architecture simple but elegant. A bell tower rose at one end, empty now of bells, its arched openings looking out over the surrounding countryside like watchful eyes. Aria approached slowly, feeling a sense of reverence. The monastery was surrounded by what had once been cultivated gardens, but were now half wild, filled with herbs and flowers that had escaped their original beds and spread freely. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and rosemary. The main door was not locked. Perhaps it couldn't be anymore, the mechanism long rusted. It swung open with a groan that echoed through the interior, and Aria stepped inside. The silence that greeted her was profound. It was not an empty silence, but a full one, weighted with memory and time. Aria stood in the entrance, letting her eyes adjust to the dimmer light, and listened. The monastery had been built in a cruciform shape, with a long central nave and shorter transepts. The ceiling was vaulted, rising high above her head. And when she took a step forward, she understood what Martha's grandmother had meant about the acoustics. The sound of her single footstep blossomed in the space, expanding and reflecting, bouncing off stone walls and vaulted ceiling, creating harmonics and overtones that lingered for several seconds before fading into silence. It was extraordinary, as if the building itself were a musical instrument designed to transform every sound into something beautiful. Aria walked slowly down the nave, each footstep creating its own brief symphony. She could hear layers in each sound: the initial impact, the immediate echo, the secondary reflections, the gradual decay into silence. The building was teaching her about sound in a way no natural space could, because it had been deliberately designed to enhance and beautify acoustic phenomena. She stopped in the center of the nave, where the transepts crossed, and stood very still. Then, tentatively, she hummed a single note. The effect was magical. The note was caught by the architecture and amplified, reflected, harmonized. It seemed to come back to her from a dozen different directions, creating a chord where there had been only a single tone. The sound lingered, sustained by the stone, fading so gradually that she couldn't tell when it ended, and silence began. Tears sprang to Aria's eyes. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it. Not just sounds to collect, but understanding of how sounds could be held, honored, given space to fully exist. She spent hours in the monastery, exploring its acoustic properties. She discovered that different parts of the building had different qualities. The nave was resonant and rich, perfect for creating harmony. The smaller side chapels were more intimate, offering a gentler reflection. The bell tower, when she climbed it, was open and bright, carrying sounds up and out into the air. In one of the side chapels, she found something unexpected: an old wooden lectern, still standing despite the decades of abandonment. On it lay a book, its pages yellowed and water-stained, but still legible. Aria opened it carefully and discovered it was a journal written by one of the last monks to live here. The entries were dated from 50 years ago, recording the final months before the monastery was closed. She read with growing fascination. The monk, Brother Thomas, according to his signature, wrote about many things, but he returned again and again to the subject of sound. He wrote about the daily chants, about how the monastery had been designed to lift the human voice toward the divine. He wrote about the bells that had once hung in the tower, each one tuned to create a perfect harmony when rung together. And then, near the end of the journal, Aria found an entry that made her catch her breath. "We are the last," Brother Thomas had written. "When we leave, the chanting will stop, and these walls will fall silent. But I have come to believe that the sounds we have made here are not truly lost. Stone has memory. This building has absorbed 50 generations of prayers and songs. Even when we are gone, I believe those sounds will persist somehow, held in the very fabric of the walls. Future listeners, if they come with quiet hearts, will hear the echoes of our devotion." Aria closed the journal gently, her mind racing. Brother Thomas had understood something profound. That sound was not merely ephemeral, vanishing the instant it was made, but that it left traces, memories, patterns in the world. She looked around the silent monastery with new eyes. All the chants that had been sung here, all the prayers that had been spoken, all the bells that had been rung, were they truly gone? Or did some essence of them remain, embedded in the stone, waiting for the right listener? She sat down on the cold floor, her back against a pillar, and let her eyes drift closed. She stilled her breathing, quieted her mind, and listened with every fiber of her being. At first, there was only silence. But as she sank deeper into stillness, she began to hear something. It might have been imagination, or the wind moving through the empty building, or the acoustic properties playing tricks. But it sounded like voices, very distant, singing in harmony. It sounded like bells, so faint they might be memory rather than sound. It sounded like the accumulated resonance of 500 years of devotion. Aria sat there for a long time, listening to the monastery's ghost sounds, and understanding slowly dawned. This was her answer. This was how sounds could be preserved, not through recording devices or written notation, but through spaces that honored them, through attention that received them fully, through memory that held them with care. She could create a library of sounds, not as a physical repository, but as a practice, a discipline, a way of being in the world. She could teach others to listen as she had learned to listen. She could help people understand that every sound, if attended to with care, became a kind of permanent gift, stored not in devices, but in the listening heart. The idea filled her with quiet excitement. She didn't need to build anything or create an institution. The library of sounds already existed, everywhere, always. She just needed to help people access it. She set pen to paper. The monastery taught me that sounds are never truly lost. They live in memory, in stone, in the listening heart. The library of sounds is not a place but a practice. My gift is not to preserve sounds, but to teach others how to hear them fully. As the afternoon light began to fade, Aria rose and walked slowly around the monastery one more time, saying goodbye. She ran her hand along the cool stone walls, feeling the weight of history they held. She stood once more in the center of the nave and hummed a note, offering it as a kind of prayer or blessing. The building received her sound, amplified it, and gave it back to her transformed. The note swelled and faded, and in that moment Aria felt she was joining her voice with all those who had sung in this space before her. Then she walked out into the evening, leaving the monastery to its silence and its memories. The path back to the village was different in the slanting light, and Aria walked slowly, thinking about what she had learned. She had started her journey believing she was collecting sounds to preserve them. But now she understood that sounds didn't need to be preserved. They needed to be honored in the moment they occurred, received fully, attended to with complete presence. That attention, that full receiving, was what created the library. Every sound she had truly heard, the bees in the orchard, the old apple tree, the ocean's waves, the mountain wind, the village settling into night, the monastery's echoes. All of them lived in her now, not as memories, but as transformations of her own consciousness. She had been changed by every sound she had collected. She was herself becoming a kind of library, a living repository of peaceful moments, of the earth's gentle songs. As she walked, the evening star appeared above the horizon, bright and steady. Aria smiled at it, feeling a deep sense of rightness, of coming home to a truth she had. Chapter 8. The Gift of Silence. The journey home took Aria 3 days. She walked without hurry, savoring each landscape she passed through, listening to the sounds with new understanding. She no longer felt the urgency to collect, to grasp, to hold onto each sound. Instead, she practiced simple presence, allowing sounds to arise and pass away naturally, like waves on the shore. Some she noted in her journal, others she simply received and released, trusting that the important ones would stay with her in the ways that mattered. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, she crested the final hill and saw her cottage in the valley below. It looked exactly as she had left it, the stone walls golden in the late afternoon light, the climbing roses swaying gently in the breeze. But she was not the same person who had left. She had been changed by her journey, expanded by the sounds she had heard, deepened by the insights she had gained. As she walked down the familiar path to her cottage, she heard her stream, the one that had been her companion for so many years. Its voice greeted her like an old friend, and she stopped to listen, feeling tears of homecoming prick her eyes. She was home, and yet she understood now that home was not just this place, but a way of being, a quality of attention, a depth of presence, a capacity to hear the world's gentle songs wherever she went. Inside the cottage, everything was as she had left it. Dust motes danced in the slanting sunlight. Her teapot sat on the shelf. Her chair waited by the cold fireplace. The familiar creaks and sighs of the old building welcomed her back. Aria set down her satchel and opened all the windows, letting fresh air flow through the rooms. Then she made herself tea and sat in her chair, looking out at the valley and thinking about what came next. She had learned what she needed to learn. The question now was how to share it. The answer came to her over the following days, not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual unfolding. She would offer herself as a teacher, not in a formal way, but simply by being available to those who wanted to learn to listen more deeply. She put out word to the villages she had visited, through people like Thomas the orchardist and Martha the baker and Robert on his bench. The message was simple. If you want to learn to hear the peaceful sounds that surround you, come to the cottage in the valley. She didn't know if anyone would come, but she trusted that the right people would find their way to her. Just as she had found her way to the orchard, the forest, the ocean, the mountains, and the monastery. The first visitor arrived a week later, a young woman named Claire, who worked as a nurse in a city hospital. She arrived looking exhausted, carrying tension in her shoulders and shadows under her eyes. "I heard you teach people to listen," Claire said. "I need to learn. The noise in my life? It's drowning me. I can't think, can't sleep, can't find any peace." Aria welcomed her in and made tea. They sat together in silence for a while, just breathing, just being. Then Aria led Claire outside to sit by the stream. "We're not going to do anything," Aria said gently. "We're just going to listen, not trying to change anything or fix anything, just receiving what's here." They sat by the stream for an hour. At first, Claire was restless, fidgeting, her mind clearly racing. But gradually, as the stream's voice continued its patient song, Aria saw her begin to settle. Her shoulders dropped. Her breathing slowed. Her face softened. When they finally went back inside, Claire's eyes were bright with tears. "I heard it," she whispered. "For the first time in months, my mind was quiet. I just heard the water. It was so simple. Why did I forget something so simple?" "We all forget," Aria said. "The world is loud and demanding. But the peaceful sounds are always there, waiting for us to remember them." Claire stayed for 3 days, learning to listen to the stream, to birdsong, to wind in the trees, to her own breathing. When she left, she looked like a different person, rested, centered, at peace. "I'll come back," she promised, "and I'll practice this. Every day, I'll find time to just listen." The second visitor arrived a week later. His name was William, a man in his 70s with white hair and eyes that carried a deep sorrow. He stood at Aria's door, hat in hand, looking uncertain. "My wife passed 2 months ago," he said quietly. 52 years we were married. The house, it's so quiet now. Too quiet. I can't bear it." Someone in the village said that you teach people about silence. I don't know if that's what I need, but... Aria invited him in. She made tea, and they sat together without speaking for a long while. She could see the weight he carried, the way grief sat on his shoulders like a physical burden. "Tell me about her," Aria said gently. William's eyes filled with tears. "Eleanor. She sang all the time, in the kitchen, in the garden while she worked. Nothing fancy. Just old songs, hymns, things her mother taught her. The house was always full of her voice. And now," he gestured helplessly, "the silence is unbearable." Aria nodded slowly. "The silence feels empty because you're listening for what's missing. May I show you something different?" She led him outside to the meadow behind her cottage. They sat on the grass, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. "Close your eyes," Aria said. "I want you to listen, but not for Eleanor's voice. Listen for everything else that's here. Don't try to find meaning or make sense of it. Just notice." William sat with his eyes closed. At first, his face was tense, his breathing shallow. But gradually, as the minutes passed, Aria watched him begin to settle. His breathing deepened. The lines around his mouth softened. After perhaps 20 minutes, a bird began to sing, a blackbird, its song rich and melodious. William's eyes opened, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Eleanor loved blackbirds," he whispered. "She always said they sang like they had important news to share." "Listen," Aria said gently. "The blackbird is singing now, not instead of Eleanor, but alongside your memory of her. The silence in your house, it's not empty, William. It's full of 52 years of shared life. Every room holds her voice if you listen with your heart instead of your ears." They sat together as the blackbird continued its song. When it finally fell silent, William spoke again. I think I've been running from the quiet. Keeping the radio on, the television, anything to fill the space. But maybe..." He paused, listening to the breeze moving through the grass. "Maybe the quiet is where she still is." "Silence is a container," Aria said. "It holds everything, joy and sorrow, presence and absence, memory and hope. When you learn to listen to it deeply, you find that nothing is ever truly lost." William stayed until evening. They sat by the stream, walked through the meadow, stood under the oak tree as dusk fell. Aria taught him her practice, how to be still, how to open his attention, how to receive the world's sounds as gifts rather than distractions. When he finally left, his face was different. The sorrow was still there. It would be with him for a long time, but it was no longer unbearable. There was something else alongside it now, a kind of quiet peace, a sense that he could carry both his grief and his life forward together. "Thank you," he said at her door. "I'll practice this, and I think I'll start singing myself. Eleanor's songs. It's another way of listening, isn't it? Singing the silence full." Aria smiled. Yes, it is." After William, others came. A teacher burned out from years of difficult work, a teenager struggling with anxiety, a musician who had lost his love of music. To each one, Aria offered the same gift, the practice of deep listening. She took them to different places: the stream, the meadow, the oak tree on the hill behind her cottage. She taught them to be still, to be patient, to allow sounds to come to them rather than grasping after them. And she watched as, one by one, they reconnected with something essential. A capacity for peace that had always been within them, but had been buried under noise and busyness and the relentless demands of modern life. Aria discovered that teaching deepened her own practice. Each person who came brought their own questions, their own struggles, their own insights. And in helping them learn to listen, she learned to listen more deeply herself. One evening, as autumn was beginning to paint the valley in shades of gold and amber, Aria sat alone by her window, watching the sun set. The light was extraordinary, long golden rays slanting across the valley, making everything glow as if lit from within. She thought about her journey, about all the sounds she had collected, the bees in the orchard, the old apple tree, the rain on blossoms, the deer in the forest, the ocean's waves, the wind in the mountain valley, the village at dusk, the monastery's echoes. Each sound was a gift, a teaching, a moment of grace. And now, by sharing the practice of deep listening, she was passing those gifts on, multiplied and transformed. She opened her journal, the leather-bound book that had accompanied her on her journey, and turned to a fresh page. She wanted to write something that would capture what she had learned, something that future visitors might read and understand. She wrote, "To those who come seeking peace, the sounds you are looking for are not far away. They are here now, all around you. The world is always singing its gentle songs. You need only remember how to listen." Listening is not a passive act, but an active opening of your whole being. It requires stillness, patience, and a willingness to receive without judgment. Start simply. Choose one sound: a bird, a stream, the wind, your own breath. Give it your complete attention for just a few minutes. Don't try to think about it or analyze it. Just let it be and let yourself receive it. Do this daily, and you will find that your capacity to hear peace grows. You will begin to notice sounds you never heard before. You will find moments of quiet in the midst of noise. You will discover that the library of peaceful sounds is infinite, and it is always open to you. This is my gift to you, not the sounds themselves, but the practice of hearing them. Take it with you wherever you go. Share it with others. And know that in doing so, you are making the world a more peaceful place, one listening heart at a time. With gratitude, Aria. She set down her pen and looked out at the darkening valley. The first stars were appearing overhead, tiny points of light in the deepening blue. An owl called from the woods, the same woods where she had slept beneath the pine tree, listening to the night sounds. Aria felt complete. Not finished, her work would continue. There would always be more to learn, more to share, but complete in a deeper sense. She had found her purpose, her way of serving, her gift to offer. The sound collector had become the listening teacher, and in teaching others to hear the world's peaceful songs, she had discovered the deepest peace of all. The peace that comes from living in alignment with one's truest calling. A breeze stirred, and she heard her climbing roses rustle against the cottage wall, the same sound that had been one of the first she ever consciously collected years ago when she was just beginning to learn to listen. She smiled, recognizing the perfection of this circle. She had journeyed far and learned much, and now she was home, hearing the same sounds with new ears, understanding them in new ways. Outside, the night was settling over the valley. The stream continued its eternal conversation with the stones. The wind whispered through the grass. The earth breathed in the darkness, patient and ancient, and infinitely peaceful. And Aria, the sound collector, the listening teacher, sat in her cottage and received it all. The symphony of existence, played just for her, played for everyone, played for no one, simply playing because that is what the world does. She closed her journal, extinguished her lamp, and sat for a long time in the darkness, listening to the sound of the valley settling into sleep, listening to her own heartbeat, steady and calm, listening to the silence between sounds, the silence that, she had learned, was not empty but full, not absent but present, not nothing but everything. And in that full silence, that pregnant pause between one sound and the next, Aria heard the gift that lay beneath all the others. The gift of simply being here, alive, aware, able to witness the extraordinary beauty of this ordinary world. That was the truest sound collection of all. Not sounds preserved in memory or journal or teaching, but this moment, right now, exactly as it is. Perfect. Complete. At peace.